Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Tove Jansson's 1972 novel, The Summer Book, translated from the Swedish by Thomas Teal and published by NYRB. Tove Jansson was a Swedish-Finnish author, illustrator, all-around artist, probably most famous for creating the beloved children's series, The Moomins. But she wrote quite a few novels for adults as well. She was born in Helsinki, and her parents were Swedish, so she writes in Swedish, though she spent most of her life in what is now Finland. In fact, she spent most of her adult life on a tiny island in the Gulf of Finland, which is exactly where this book takes place. The Summer Book is an incredible meditation on childhood, old age, familial relationships, and the fleeting nature of all of those things. This book is made up of a series of vignettes that read much more like a collection of short stories than a novel, and all of these stories take place on this small island in the Gulf of Finland, where this small family lives during the summer. And this family consists of a 6-year-old girl who is kind of our main character named Sophia, and her father, who we never really see much of at all. He's always kind of hanging out in the background, always working on something that we don't really know. And then there is Sophia's grandmother, who lives with them as well, and who is an amazing character that we spend a lot of this book with. And these vignettes are really about these just very small moments, these small interactions between Sophia and her grandmother, in which they go on imaginative adventures, talk about nature, debate the existence of God, witness a storm, etc. There's quite a wide range in these small moments that they share. And this pairing of this very fiercely independent young girl who is trying to figure out her spot in the world, and this elderly woman who is full of wisdom and wit and has opinions on everything, is really what makes this book so wonderful. You kind of have these two opposite ends of life, but of course, they aren't really opposites, but instead they're complementary. They disagree all the time, but it's in their disagreement that we get the most insight. And I think that this is actually where Jansson's ability as a children's book writer really comes in. Jansson isn't only writing for children in her children's books, and isn't just writing for adults in her adult books, but she's always kind of writing for everyone. And in fact, the point of view of most of this book kind of supports that, as our narration moves fluidly between focusing on Sophia and focusing on her grandmother, which in a way kind of decenters both of those characters. And what is actually in the center of this novel, which was actually the focus of this novel, is the relationship between these two characters. This book doesn't really have a plot. Instead, it's interested in emotions and the ebb and flow of life. Indeed, this whole book takes place on this island, which kind of resists any sort of change, except for the tide moving in and out. There is, however, one change that greatly affects this book. In the opening paragraph to the second story, the second vignette, we get a single reference to this cataclysmic event that happened just before the opening pages of this book. It just reads, "One time in April there was a full moon, and the sea was covered with ice. Sophia woke up and remembered that they had come back to the island and that she had a bed to herself because her mother was dead. The fire was still burning in the stove, and the flames flickered on the ceiling where the boots were hung up to dry. She climbed down to the floor, which was very cold, and looked out through the window." None of these stories are about this tragedy, but none of these stories escape that tragedy either. And of course, if we wanted to give a biographical reading of this book, Tove Jansson published this book just a year after the death of her own mother. But this meditation on loss and on grief is always floating in the background of all of these stories, especially as we see the grandmother, Sophia's only real friend throughout this book, kind of dealing with things like aging and vertigo and having difficulty getting around the island. She's already lived this very full life that we get very small glimpses of, but we never really get the full story. A very long time ago, grandmother had wanted to tell about all the things they did, but no one had bothered to ask. And now she had lost the urge. It seems to be a terrible fact in life that grandchildren only become really interested in the lives that their grandparents led just a bit too late. So this is a bit grim, but this book never reads like it's very heavy. It's often incredibly lighthearted, breezy, adventurous, and really quite funny, I think. Some of my favorite stories are the ones where Sophia and her grandmother simply play and they use their imagination to, build cities and kingdoms on the island. There's something so pure and universal about this. It reminds me of playing with my nieces. But there's also something so profound in its escapism, in its dreaminess. Fantasy and imagination are very useful ways at getting at life's truths. It sort of reminded me of Pan's Labyrinth in a lot of different ways, though I love that movie, so I probably just think about it too much. But in their imaginative games, they're always searching to uncover something, and there is this interplay between the ordinary and quiet and mundane life of this family on this island and the magical imagination of Sophia and her grandmother and the games that they play. The forest on the island is a forest, but it's also a magical forest full of monsters and animals and insects that demand to be anthropomorphized. And we see this in the description of the forest, which goes on for pages, and I'll try to resist reading it all. On the outside of the island, beyond the bare rock, there was a stand of dead forest. It lay right in the path of the wind, and for many hundreds of years had tried to grow directly into the teeth of every storm, and had thus acquired an appearance all its own. From a passing rowboat, it was obvious that each tree was stretching away from the wind. They crouched and twisted, and many of them crept. Eventually the trunks broke or rotted and then sank, the dead trees supporting or crushing those still green at the top. Altogether, they formed a tangled mass of stubborn resignation. The ground was shiny with brown needles, except where the spruces had decided to crawl instead of stand, their greenery luxuriating in a kind of frenzy, damp and glossy, as if in a jungle. This forest was called the Magic Forest. It had shaped itself with slow and laborious care, and the balance between survival and extinction was so delicate that even the smallest change was unthinkable. So you can just see that this passage is dripping with personification. And there's also, pretty clear parallels between how the trees withstand the storms and how our main characters withstand the storms. But what I find so interesting is how this forest is personified, but how it's also being actively personified and anthropomorphized by Sophia and her grandmother. Just a little while later in that chapter, after we get that 3-page description of the forest, we see grandmother in the woods. But grandmother sat in the magic forest and carved out landish animals. She cut them from branches and driftwood and gave them paws and faces, but she only hinted at what they looked like and never made them too distinct. They retained their wooden soles, and the curve of their backs and legs, and the enigmatic shape of growth itself, and remained a part of the decaying forest. Sophia and her grandmother are like Prospero in Shakespeare's The Tempest, and the island is their playground as they command the elements and the flora and the fauna. There's even a chapter with a massive storm, though unfortunately there's no Ariel to flame amazement during The Tempest. But all of the things on the island are props on the stage of Sophia and her grandmother's ongoing imaginative game. They build cities. There's a great chapter where they build the city of Venice in the marshlands, for instance. And both of these characters take part. Sophia seems to enjoy the imaginative possibility of such things, and her grandmother enjoys reliving all the memories of her youth, which she spent traveling and going on all other sorts of adventures. There's something melancholy about all of these games, though, as they seem to be trying to construct a new life. When they're building Venice, for instance, Sophia insists that her grandmother call her dear child, and that she call her grandmother mama. And inside the Doge's palace, inside their newly built Venice, well, of course, they place a mother and a father and a child. Like I mentioned earlier, the loss of Sophia's mother haunts this book. And to go alongside this haunting trauma, there's all these images of diving and unburying and going below. They're always trying to unearth something or uncover or perhaps exhume something. I think Freud would have a lot to say about these moments, but I think Jansson is getting at some really interesting ideas. In the first chapter, for instance, grandmother loses her false teeth among the peonies. And so, of course, Sophia offers to help her look for them. And the text reads, "She dived beneath the flowering roof of the garden and crept among green stalks and stems. It It was pretty and mysterious down on the soft black earth. And there were the teeth, white and pink, a whole mouthful of old teeth. "I've got them," the child cried, and stood up. "Put them back in." "But you can't watch," grandmother said. "That's private." Sophia held the teeth behind her back. "I want to watch," she said. So grandmother put the teeth in with a smacking noise. They went in very easily. It had really hardly been worth mentioning. "When are you going to die?" the child asked. And then grandmother answered, "Soon, but that is not the least concern of yours." "Why?" her grandchild asked. She didn't answer. She walked out on the rock and on towards the ravine. And then they go and they explore this ravine that, very importantly, the father doesn't want either of them going near, right? It's a dangerous ravine. But this conversation about the grandmother's death goes on, and the text reads, "Will they dig a hole?" asked the child amiably. "Yes," she said, "a big hole." And she added insidiously, "Big enough for all of us." "How come?" the child asked. They walked on towards the point. I've never been this far before," Sophia said. "Have you?" "No," her grandmother said. And then to end this scene, Sophia goes down into the ravine and goes swimming in the deep water all alone for the first time. So you can see how there's just these layers to this conversation, right? They're talking about multiple things at once. But there's also just this constant imagery of depth, of sinking, of diving and digging and unearthing that I just find so interesting because it continues throughout this entire book. It's not just in this one story. And of course, in that first story, the thing that grandmother loses and Sophia finds are false teeth. And grandmother wants to hide those teeth from Sophia. And so I think there's this added layer of deception in a way, as false teeth are kind of a prop or a part of a costume that I think helps establish a lot of the theater metaphors and the theater imagery that this book explores alongside the trauma of Sophia's mother dying, and all of this alongside the imaginative play between these two characters. All of these things work together and they're all kind of probing and digging at this trauma. Tove Jansson explores childhood in a way that I think few writers are really able to do. She mixes these juvenile themes, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but these juvenile themes of like exploration and growing up and trying to understand the world with these really compelling and interesting explorations of life and death and some of the harshest of life's truths. And this book reads so easily, but it has a depth to it that, at least in my experience, very few books that are ostensibly about childhood really have. There's almost an excavation and subsequent staging of childhood that, when you think of Tove Jansson writing this book in her late 50s, is really quite powerful. The Summer Book is such a quiet and beautiful book that is really just a perfect late summer read. Nothing really happens, but by the end of it, at least I felt like everything happened. An entire summer happened. It's a surprisingly moving book as well that explores so many facets of life, from the small and seemingly insignificant to the large and inescapably important. Tove Jansson is such an incredible writer, and the Summer Book packs in so much into such a short little book. I can't wait to pick up more of her stuff. But for now, thanks for watching.